This is a book in quotes. What's really going on here? How to navigate life using the hidden intelligence of our emotional brain. By Robin Tichik, Elise Krishna, and Bruce Ecker. Adapting to our environment is an inborn skill necessary for survival. People's behavior and feelings are governed largely by unconscious assumptions about the world, learnings that are outside of their awareness. Melanie's choices have a deep hidden sense outside of her awareness. She doesn't even see them as choices. It's simply how it is. The deep lasting change of behaviors and habits requires discovering the emotional learnings at the root of those patterns. Neuroscientists were convinced that the best we could do was to learn new habits that override and suppress the old ones. Recent neuroscience research that shows how even the most stubborn of old unquestioned assumptions and learnings can, in fact, be erased and replaced with completely new emotional learnings that, in the present, serve us better than the original ones. We now know that the brain not only has the ability to create such learnings, it also has the ability under particular conditions to dissolve or unlearn them. This ability of the brain to reorganize itself based on usage is called neuroplasticity. But our brains do so much more. They have also been storing emotional knowledge our whole lives. It is the emotional quality of experiences that our brains use for selecting what is important to learn. And this process takes place largely outside of conscious awareness, in other words, implicitly. The emotional brain forms implicit constructs, particular units of learning, about how the world causes suffering or pleasure. So when we use the term emotional brain, think about the brain's ability to store deeply and firmly anything it experiences and learns with great emotional intensity. People are, of course, a complex mixture of nature and nurture, genetics plus environment. What people do makes complete emotional sense based on their constructs about how the world is. This is the concept of emotional coherence. We form constructs that allow us to anticipate how our environment will behave so that we can adapt to it, to minimize our suffering and maximize our well-being. Our constructs have survival value. And such constructs are fully coherent, not illogical or arbitrary. When we become accustomed to thinking within a mindset of emotional coherence, when we practice remembering that a person's actions and reactions do make deep sense, it becomes a more straightforward concept and begins to feel simpler. We have defined emotional coherence to mean that what people do makes deep emotional sense within them, even if that sense is outside of their awareness. New learnings don't go immediately into long-term memory, but are held initially in a short-term fragile form. The process in the brain of shifting a new learning from short-term memory to long-term stable memory is called memory consolidation. This process typically requires weeks and takes place in phases that move the neurally recorded learning from one portion of the brain to another. People's deep emotional truths about themselves and their world are, therefore, extremely tenacious learnings formed in the presence of strong emotion. These adaptive learnings become deeply ingrained, not only due to being so unquestioned and habitual, but also because of this neurological process of extra strong memory consolidation. These learnings are locked in by special, very durable synapses. These learnings are formed not in words and not even in awareness, so they are often referred to as implicit learnings. Memory researchers have observed that under certain specific conditions, the well-locked synapses that encode and store our learnings can become labile or unstable and changeable. A memory that has been destabilized in this way remains unstable for a period of approximately 5 hours, and then the memory reconsolidates. Its synapses become stable and durable again. This process of destabilizing a specific target emotional memory, opening the memory to change of content, is called memory reconsolidation. The target emotional learning, the original learning, must be consciously reactivated so that what that learning knows or expects feels alive and present in the foreground of awareness. And while that reactivation is happening, there must also be an experience of something that is contrary to what the reactivated target learning knows or expects. In other words, what's required is the experience of reactivation plus a second concurrent experience of what researchers term memory mismatch or prediction error, meaning something strikingly discrepant from what the reactivated target memory knows or expects. It makes sense that reconsolidation, being the brain's process for updating memories, would be triggered only by new information that is at odds with the contents of a reactivated memory. So this experience of a discrepancy between the original target learning's expectations about how the world will function, what the meanings of things are, and what is actually being perceived is a mismatch experience or a prediction error experience. That is what causes the target learning's synapses to quickly destabilize, launching the process of memory reconsolidation and allowing actual change at the neurological level of a lifelong limiting learning. Just as memory consolidation is nature's way of making sure that important learnings get stored long term, so is memory reconsolidation nature's way for us to get free of tenacious learnings that no longer serve us optimally in changed circumstances in the present, by updating these learnings based on more current experiences. If we assume coherence, that a person's emotional brain is making sense according to what was learned in the past, then we also recognize that that person is the only possible source of knowledge of what that deep sense is. It is tempting at times to interpret or form our own notions about what a person's behaviors mean, and even to pathologize, counteract, criticize, or try to correct a person. But that would mean that I believe I know better than you do about your past experiences and the truth of the world you inhabit. And that is inconsistent with thinking in terms of emotional coherence. In the perspective of the emotional coherence framework, discovering what lies beneath a person's actions and reactions is well worth the time and effort it takes to do that, because that is the route to transformational change, and the first step along that route consists of discovering a person's particular implicit emotional truths or constructs. Once we begin looking through the lens of emotional coherence and understanding that each person's world consists of his or her unique mental constructs, we realize that pathologizing cannot lead to correct understanding of a person. Neurologically, there is a significant difference between transformational change, change that is deep and lasting, and counteractive change, change that only suppresses a behavior or overrides one response pattern with another. From neuroscience, we know that counteractive learnings leave the original learnings intact. Counteractive learnings are additional learnings that are stored separately in the brain from the original learnings. New learning always creates new neural circuits in the brain, but it is only when new learning replaces and eliminates old learning that transformational change occurs. A counteractive response functions as a wall or a detour sign, since it diverts people from becoming aware of their own underlying learnings, feelings, needs, and meanings, and finding their own path. Counteracting actually strengthens the suppression of what's underneath and is coherently driving people's responses. We can interact with people by attempting to understand their world of meaning instead of imposing our own interpretations, hypotheses, or counteractive advice. Real understanding of another person necessitates the voluntary suspension of one's own assumptions about that other person's emotional truths. Real understanding of another person also necessitates that we tolerate the state of not knowing, because we really don't know what the other person's emotional learnings are. It is normal and even unavoidable for us to have our own hypotheses, of course, as well as our own unquestioned assumptions about what's going on with another person. We can test out our hypotheses, but always with the knowledge that the other person is the real authority on his or her emotional truths, and therefore the sole source of reliable knowledge about that. Let's look at criticism in a new light, through the lens of assuming coherence in all the people we come in contact with. Then we realize that criticism expresses the fundamentally incorrect assumption that the behavior being criticized is invalid or senseless. Accepting a person is not the same as liking everything about that person or the person's behavior. Accepting a person means only knowing that the person is functioning in accordance with his or her emotional truths about how to have well-being. A healthy, respectful relationship, whether with oneself or with another person, is based on acceptance of a person as the individual he or she is. Criticism is defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary as the act of expressing disapproval and of noting the problems or faults of another person or thing, and a remark or comment that expresses disapproval of something or someone. In other words, criticism is typically a type of negative evaluation or an accusation of being bad, incompetent, stupid, sick, or crazy. The person who is experiencing the problem, or owning the problem as we sometimes put it, is the person who is in the best position to know whether a particular solution really fits. There are extreme cases, of course, where parents and teachers have to take over ownership of a child's problem in order to protect the child from possible serious harm. Usually, though, supporting children in solving their own problems is an invaluable way for them to learn and grow. It can be challenging to let go of problem ownership when it's your child or your student, for instance, to whom the problems belong. But clarity as to problem ownership can often even provide a measure of relief for parents and teachers, and can provide children with an important learning opportunity. What is Maria doing here? She is listening, hearing, accepting, and understanding what Anne is trying to communicate, and she is reflecting back to Anne what she has understood so far, in a way that invites more from Anne. She is knowingly not injecting her own opinions or advice into the conversation. There may come a time when Anne seems to want her mother's opinion or advice, but she has not yet indicated that. Many people are concerned that empathizing with another person's uncomfortable feelings only leads to the other person's distress intensifying. For that reason, people often respond counteractively in an attempt to help the person out of those feelings, for instance by minimizing the uncomfortable feelings or by distracting the person from those feelings. Distress doesn't intensify, it subsides when the listener seems to really understand and get it. When a person feels heard and understood, that fulfills a basic need, and then he or she can more easily move on to the practical issues of solving the problem at hand, because the uncomfortable emotions are less heavily in the foreground. A parent's anxiety about negative attitudes is the parent's problem, and it mustn't be allowed to take over the conversation and cut off the flow of understanding for the child's problem and feelings. Listening to the owner of a problem is often called active listening. It means listening for and expressing that you've actually heard another person's thoughts, feelings, and emotional meanings, while putting one's own needs on hold for the time being. Thomas's approach can be described as a classic I message, in which the problem owner describes the problem without any blame or criticism and expresses his needs and feelings. The absence of criticism and accusations towards the other person is crucial for the message to be heard. I messages are in keeping with the principle of emotional coherence, that each person is the expert on his or her own coherent needs and feelings and knowings, and is already behaving according to a coherent but very personal and unique framework of meaning. I messages also give the speaker an opportunity to become more aware of his or her own inner state and processes. Remember how Maria listened acceptingly to Anne, who didn't want to go to swimming class? She helped Anne to uncover her own personal meanings and limiting assumptions, which enabled Anne to find a more beneficial, less limiting solution, and perhaps even grow in maturity and emotional strength. It is the particular meaning that a person gives to an experience that leads to that person's emotions, thoughts, and other reactions in response. But even a person's reluctance or resistance to approaching certain issues or feeling certain feelings is coherent. In other words, the reluctance itself has its reasons and deserves to be respected and accepted. Until the turn of the millennium, neuroscientists believed that emotional learnings were stored in our brains permanently, locked in with no key. Remember, emotional learnings are deeply rooted out-of-awareness learnings about how the world functions and how people are. We now know that the brain has not only the ability to create such learnings, it also has the ability to dissolve or deeply unlearn emotional learnings. And the brain has a well-defined process for doing that. We can make active use of the brain's inborn capabilities of forming and dissolving emotional learnings. Once a deeply embedded emotional learning has been discovered and richly experienced, it can be unlearned in favor of new knowledge based on newer experiences. When an original emotional learning is being actively, consciously experienced, and at the same time a different and contradictory emotional learning is in the person's awareness, something very special and fascinating can happen. It's as if the brain realizes, oh, what I have been expecting to happen isn't how the world functions after all. I'd better pay attention to this and revise what I thought I knew. In response to that experience, those extra durable synapses that have locked in the original emotional learning become temporarily unlocked and changeable. Then that learning can be modified or erased by other newer learnings based on direct perceptions that feel unmistakably true. We do not need to settle for counteractive methods that compete with the responses they attempt to suppress or override. We have the key for unlocking the emotional brain.